Good morning for those on the West Coast and good afternoon for those on the East Coast. We have a great second day of the Trifectas, Blue Trifectas event that we've been holding. Yesterday, we had a terrific discussion about the general challenges that blue states are facing and the kinds of coalitional issues that arise as they address pressing policy problems. Today, we have an amazing set of panels to talk about the way in which states that are governed by Democrats in the contemporary era are addressing pressing policy challenges that they face. And there are the two policy challenges that we're considering are two that have really vexed these states, particularly the first one, housing affordability, that we'll be talking about today. And then first, and then we'll turn to the challenges of decarbonization in these states. I'm Jacob Hacker. I'm director of the American Political Economy Exchange. This is an event that's co-sponsored by the American Political Economy Exchange at Yale and the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative at Berkeley. I really want to thank all of you for being here and these amazing panelists for joining us, as well as Sam Trackman and Paul Pearson, who together helped us organize this conference. We have a large number of folks who are participating, and we have a number of people on the panel, and so I want us to jump in as quickly as possible. Yesterday, Paul kicked us off with a general discussion of some of the the core reasons we were holding this event and some of the issues that we were considering. And I won't repeat his remarks here, except to say that at this moment of democratic peril, it's really important to think about the role of blue states in our political economy, and to consider very seriously some of the challenges that these states have faced in producing good policy outcomes and holding together their democratic coalitions. And so yesterday, as for those who joined us know, we really talked about some of the general challenges and some of the general coalitional dynamics. But today, as I said, we're going to be really focusing in on these two core policy areas, housing and decarbonization. Without further ado, I want to introduce our panel. It's a really remarkable group, and they span the worlds of housing policy research and action. They also span a large number of blue states, and they know a lot about in most cases, more than one of the states. Now, yesterday we really focused a fair amount on a few key states, and I think we'll continue that today, notably really thinking seriously about what's happening in California and New York. And so I'm not going to offer a big introductory remarks for each of the panelists. Instead, I want to just quickly introduce all five of them. And then hand things off to Alex Brennan. So we have today, the panelists are Alex Brenner, the Executive Director at FutureWise, Anne Marie Gray, the Executive Director at Open New York. We have Chris Elmendorf, a professor at UC Davis School of Law. We have David Schleicher, professor at Yale Law School here in New Haven. And then finally, we're really excited to have Libby Murphy, the Director of Policy at the Minnesota Housing Partnership. Just to give you a sense of how this will proceed, each of the panelists will make a few relatively brief remarks up front. And then we're going to have a conversation among them that I will facilitate, and then we will open it up to the Q&A. So as anybody who's done a webinar before knows, you can post your questions in the Q&A section, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. Paul Pearson did a very good job of bringing all the questions in, and I'm going to do my best to try to emulate his great example today. So with that, let me warmly welcome Alex Brennan. Alex, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Jacob. Thanks for having me. I'm really interested to hear from the other panelists and glad to be part of this discussion today. I'm the executive director of an organization called FutureWise based in Washington State that plays a role in state housing conversations, we work on primarily land use and planning policy. And so a lot of the issues that um, we are sort of the lead on housing are kind of directly related to the regulations around the supply of housing. Um, so that's the area I want to put a caveat on my remarks. That's the area I'm the most familiar with, but I'll talk a little bit to some of the other major housing policies that Washington State has been focused on the last couple of years. Um, Housing has really been a top priority, if not the top priority for the Washington State Legislature over the last at least 5 years. And there have been a series of really major policy changes at the state level throughout that time. Um, the and they kind of come in cycles. So I think talking about a little bit about that progression will be helpful. And they also come in a framework that I think is relevant to the coalition building in a blue trifecta state, which is a supply subsidy stability framework. So I can get into that a little bit more, but sort of the idea is that we're going to pass policies that are fit within each of those buckets. So supply, how do we make it easier to build more housing? Subsidy, how do we invest public money to subsidize the cost of housing for the people who can least afford it? And stability, how do we create more stability, more protections for renters as well as homeowners from things like foreclosure. Um, I the so I think back when I started working on this in 2019, the state was doing fairly small things like incentive programs for small changes at the local level to housing regulations. So in 2019 and 2020, we worked on bills that provided funding for cities to do kind of local planning on housing, and we removed some of the environmental review requirements for implementing a menu of different policies that would increase housing or increase affordable housing specifically. Um, the first kind of big change to that framework was in 2021, which was an overhaul to the state's housing element requirements, which are something that has to get updated every 10 years and is sort of the governing document for regulations of housing at the local level. Previously, the state requirements had been pretty hands-off. And this was the first time that the state really came in and said, you need to be doing a lot more specifically to allow housing. We're going to give you targets, specific affordability levels that you're going to have to plan for. You're going to have to remove a variety of different types of regulatory barriers at the local level. And there was also a very specific kind of companion component of that around removing barriers to permanent supportive housing and shelter. And that was really the first time that the state kind of directly intervened in issues of local control, and where you saw advocates for local control essentially lose a legislative fight on that issue. Then the next kind of big wave of policies that we worked on was passed in 2023. And the sort of marquee policies changes there were what we call the missing middle housing requirement. So this directly required that cities allow things like duplexes, accessory dwelling units, and in larger cities up to sixplexes in all residential neighborhoods across the state. And there were a variety of different companion legislative pieces to that around the building code, environmental review. And I should also add, throughout this entire time period, Washington State has something called the State Housing Trust Fund, which is the primary vehicle for state funding for affordable housing. And that continued to increase throughout this period pretty significantly. And then the kind of most recent wave of those housing policy bills was in this most recent legislative session. where we saw new minimum density requirements near high capacity transit path, and we saw the elimination of many parking requirements throughout the state, and we saw a state rent stabilization bill, so a cap on annual rent increases. That was packaged with a variety of other types of tenant protections pass as well. And throughout this period, overall, the funding has gone from, and I don't actually have the origin dates on this, but about a decade or 15 years ago, we were looking at about $50 million in state housing trust fund money, and now we're up to 780 million. So that's sort of the range of increase in that funding. In terms of what has worked and what has not worked, I think there's been a lot of success, and I think that you can just point to this being a top priority for voters. I think is the biggest driver of that success. But I also think that there has been a lot of efforts to build coalitions across different constituencies that don't typically get along with each other, and trying to identify common ground and work together on certain policies, even if we're also still disagreeing on other policies. And I think we'll be able to talk more about what that looks like. Um, the other thing I think is, for us specifically, we really increased our focus on organizing and bringing more sort of grassroots engagement into the state legislative process. At the same time, because of the COVID pandemic, we saw for the first time the ability to comment and sign in legislative committees remotely. And so that really increased the ability for us to work with our supporters and partners throughout the state to do that. And many of the other organizations that we work with were doing similar things. And I think that I think those things have been really effective. I think the one area that has been a challenge is because we have a pretty structured framework for how major planning decisions happen in Washington State. There's sort of a time frame, and so sometimes we pass these major pieces of legislation, but the actual implementation is a few years out. There's a fair amount of work that sort of goes into the rulemaking and guidance, and then the local implementation before you actually see the results on the ground. So in many cases, we still haven't actually seen new homes get built in response to these policies, but we're starting to get close to that point. And I think that one other thing I'll just mention before closing is that, in addition to kind of the supply subsidy stability framework, I think the other thing that's been really key is a focus on location and focusing on housing in cities, near jobs, near transit. I think has really helped build the kind of full breadth of the coalition that we work with.
Great. Alex, thank you so much for starting us off. And I want to explore more how Washington looks relative to some of these other states. And so that's a good invitation to bring Anne-Marie Gray into the conversation. Anne-Marie is, I said, the executive director at Open New York. And I'm really interested to hear about both what she's been involved with and how it contrasts with what you're reporting, Alex.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. So yes, at Open New York, we advocate for policies that support building more housing of all kinds and ensuring that all neighborhoods are contributing to housing growth. So we organize over 800 grassroots members across the city and state. We run policy and legislative campaigns. We do endorsements. We even launched an electoral arm, given the politics in New York and how to really make headway on the issue. The organization is about 6 or 7 years old. It started informally. And I got to know them because my prior role, I was in the seat in City Hall overseeing land use and fair housing under Vicky Bean, who spoke yesterday, actually. So the movement has really, really grown and professionalized a lot in New York in the last couple of years, and it's been really exciting. I think like Similar to Alex, we have a big tech platform that includes focused on subsidized housing, tenant protection measures, building public capacity. I'm going to talk mostly about sort of the zoning reform and tackling the housing shortage piece. It's both the thing that sort of we're feeling the biggest void on, and I think is most relevant for some of the conversation. And I am going to break this up. So we cover New York City and New York State, and they're sort of tied in some ways and different in others. And I think the punchline is we're seeing some real momentum in the city, and it's more of an uphill battle in the state, but I'm just going to separate them a little bit. Happy to go into this in questions, but there's lots of scary stats about how New York City, rent levels going crazy, how little we actually build, despite people thinking there is a lot of housing in New York. And just sort of some of the worst stats, but happy to dive into that if people aren't familiar. But sort of the last like 5-ish years have been really, really interesting in this space. So in the last mayoral admin, the de Blasio administration, there was a big focus on affordable housing from the start. And by the end, there was this shift that to the importance of all neighborhoods building housing, something that, to date, the new housing that has been built in New York has been really concentrated in just a few neighborhoods. And historically, it's really been, frankly, Black and brown neighborhoods. And there's been a lot of focus on the fair housing failures of that. Towards the end, and this is something that I was working on when I was in City Hall, the city released a big fair housing plan called Where We Live. It passed the rezoning of Soho and NoHo, two of the kind of whitest, wealthiest neighborhoods in the city, and Gowanus in Brooklyn. And that both helped catalyze sort of the grassroots pro-housing movement. And it also really helped shift the narrative and create more momentum going into what we're now in the Adams administration. And so a couple even early fights that were similar in the Adams administration helped show the political value of leaning into sort of a pro-housing strategy for a new administration. And there were some really strong staff and leadership in the admin, and they proposed the first, what has been sort of the first big pro-housing win for New York, City of Yes for Housing Opportunity, which passed in December. So this, what ended up passing was 82,000 units, sort of the tagline of a little more housing in every neighborhood. It finally tackled parking minimums, ADUs, density bonuses, and had something for every part of the city, really under this lens of everyone has to do their part. And this had a much more robust and diverse outside coalition than had previously existed. We turned out members to literally 13-hour public hearings. They went until like 1 a.m. We were part of leading a coalition of 120 different groups with support from labor and seniors and homeless advocates. And it's just a coalition hadn't really existed yet. And increasingly, a lot of pro-housing city council members leaned into this and figured out how to make it their own, even when the mayor was indicted in the middle of the project. And it really did pass in the end. And it's something that's become so much bigger than just the administration. And I will say in New York, I think something that has really helped is sort of this lens of fair housing, lens of exclusionary zoning has been really important for somewhere that is as blue as New York City, and really integral to sort of developing a narrative, broadening the coalition in recent years, and frankly, creating the really salient stories of the hypocrisy of rich, largely homeowners and well-resourced liberal neighborhoods being actually the front lines of objecting to new housing proposals. And it has really helped carve a political path for a wider range of elected officials and organizations, especially on the left side, to see themselves in the fight and create salient press moments that you need to change the politics around this stuff. So it's been really interesting. Again, there's been a lot of individual projects, and City of Yes was the first citywide proposal that was really, really huge. We're even seeing it now. All the candidates for mayor have a baseline housing platform that are far more pro-housing than they would have been a few years ago. We endorsed the largest slate of city council candidates we have this year. There's a commission looking at the city charter, planning to put questions on the ballot around land use reform. So there's at least momentum. We still have a huge way to go in terms of actual outcomes. Shifting to the state, and I'll go quickly. It's a slightly different story. Again, we are filling, unlike many other states, Albany has not passed any meaningful pro-housing reforms that address the housing shortage directly. For a really long time, there's sort of been this focus on tenant protection measures pushed by tenant advocates and tax incentive pushed by real estate and union. And that has been the central fight in Albany year after year. And Just briefly, I think the last couple of years have seen a little bit of shift in that. The Governor Hochul proposed something called the Housing Compact, which was kind of the closest thing to a City of Yes concept, but for the state. But she did not have a coalition behind it. The opposition, sort of loud voices from like especially the suburbs and Republican and centrist districts in very exclusionary suburbs just sort of filled the void, and there wasn't enough coalition or groundwork to counter that. We've been working on sort of, okay, how do we learn from other states? How do we step back and introduce a much more narrow bill with a built-in coalition? We are running a bill called the Faith-Based Affordable Housing Act, or YEGB, Yes in God's Backyard, in other states, to try to sort of as like a test balloon of what is a version of a zoning reform conversation that impacts the entire state that we can take some baby steps in. It has still been an uphill battle. We've learned a huge amount and built a lot, finally built some legislators that are more supportive of this, have a really diverse group of faith leaders, like sort of understanding this, talking to legislators and educating them about the housing shortage and how this is more than just tenant protections and tax incentives. But there's just, we're kind of starting from scratch. We're filling a really huge void. The governor, unfortunately, has sort of all but abandoned the issue, and Albany is a very inside game place where things happen behind closed doors, and we're sort of building it from the ground up. So, yeah, it's and New York is losing a huge number of people to red states, and it is like Democrats all up and down the ballot. They're really struggling to treat this issue with urgency. So we got a lot to build, but there's some exciting momentum. So I will pause there.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I want to continue on this question of the city versus state at some point, and also the weakness of the coalition at the state level. And I just want to flag what you said about losing populations, because as Paul discussed yesterday, and a number of the panelists did as well, there's been a really striking exodus, and housing affordability has to be really seen as the #1 reason for that, I think. With that, I'm really excited to welcome Chris Elmendorf, professor at UC Davis School of Law, who has a lot of experience in this area and actually has a few slides he'd like to show as well.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the invitation, the great discussion, and I apologize in advance if my internet is a little glitchy. So I want to give you a little historical overview of housing policy in California, which has much longer roots than in many other states, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's going on recently. So this is a slide from a report prepared by the Legislative Analyst Office in 2015. It shows California home prices relative to the national median home price by decade. And you can see California, it's sunny, it's a nice place to live. It's always been a little bit more expensive going back to 1940 than the rest of the country. But something really changes between 1970 and 1980, where California goes from being maybe 20% more expensive than the median home in the country to almost twice as expensive. And then that pattern persists post 1980, more or less up to the present. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there is a legislative response around 1980. Housing affordability is front of mind for many people in the state. We passed Prop 13 in 1977 to cap property taxes. That was one popular response, but the legislature gets in on the action too. Passes a density bonus law, which says to developers, if you set aside some of the units in your project as deed restricted affordable housing, you can build a bigger project than the city's zoning otherwise allows. The state updates its housing element law, similar to Washington, which then starting in 1980 requires periodic updating of cities' general plans to accommodate what the state determines to be the city's share of regionally needed housing. The state passes a law called the Housing Accountability Act in 1982 that essentially creates vested rights for developers, or is supposed to create vested rights for developers. If your project complies with the rule in place, the time you submit the project application, the city can't later downzone your site. There's narrow public health or safety grounds on which the project may be denied. And finally, the first accessory dwelling unit law is passed in 1982 with a ringing legislative finding. The legislature finds and declares that there is a tremendous unmet need for new housing to shelter California's population. We get standards for local ADU ordinances, and again, limited grounds on which cities are allowed to disapprove or decide not to allow ADUs. But again, if you go back and look at the big picture of housing prices, this doesn't fix the problem. And after 1982, we enter into a long period of effectively legislative quiescence. There's action around deed restricted affordable housing in various ways between 1982 and the mid 2010s, but essentially the legislature just has put the problem on the back burner. Then something changes. Year 2017 is really a fulcrum. We have the first candidates running for state legislature on a pro-housing platform, not just saying we need more deed restricted affordable housing or we need more homeless shelters, but we need market rate housing, we need all kinds of housing. Scott Wiener from San Francisco really led the charge there. There's the formation of California YIMBY, which is the first in California statewide organization advocating for new housing of all forms. And at the end of 2017, Governor Brown signs a 15-bill housing package, which set in motion a process of annual celebrations of new housing packages that we passed every year from 2016 up to the present, often with 10 or 15 or more bills. So what do we get in this post-2016 era? We get strengthening of all of those circa 1980 laws. We get direct state upzoning of commercial sites for residential use. We get authorization for lot splits and duplexes in neighborhoods that are zoned for single-family homes only. There's a new limitation on local downzonings. If a city is going to reduce zone capacity in one area of the city, it has to offset that with increases in zone capacity in other areas. Preemption of parking minimums near transit. And finally, streamlined so-called ministerial or automatic permitting of projects that comply with objective standards in cities that aren't on track to hit their state-assigned housing targets. How's it working? Well, big picture, not so great. So the left figure here is California housing production in blue relative, or I should say building permits in blue relative to the national average state in black. This is the year 2017 in red, and you can see California production does not increase relative to the rest of the nations after 2017. The figure on the right is building permits by different type of housing in California. Single family and multifamily housing is kind of bouncing around. The one really obvious success story is accessory dwelling units, which go from being essentially nothing to, by 2022, 25,000, close to 30,000 units a year. Accessory dwelling units are now 20% of the new housing stock annually in the Bay Area and Los Angeles. So another take on, is it working? You could look at cost of building housing. There's a new Rand Institute report that's gotten a lot of attention, I think rightly, that compares cost of building multifamily housing in California with Colorado and Texas. I think this report should be taken as the first word rather than the last word on the subject, because the underlying data is rather thin, but it suggests that production costs in California are roughly 2.3 times production costs in Texas for similar types of housing. And if you look at deed restricted affordable housing, production costs are even higher. So like the true luxury housing in California is the housing we label affordable, measured by cost of production. So what's different about the accessory dwelling unit law? The one clear success story, there's no affordability or prevailing wage requirements associated with it, unlike many other of the state housing laws. There's preemption of local impact fees and price controls, again, which we haven't seen for other state housing laws. Preemption of private restrictions on development through homeowners associations or covenants, again, something we haven't seen with most of the other housing laws. There's a very clear definition under state law of what must be allowed. A backyard accessory dwelling unit of up to 800 square feet, plus a junior accessory dwelling unit of up to 550. Very minimal geographic restrictions. You can build an ADU pretty much anywhere on land that's zoned for single family homes, which is most of the residential land in the state. And there are no anti-speculation rules, which we see baked into some of the other housing laws. So the ADU law is really different from the other laws in its requirements and also in its effects. Beyond accessory dwelling units, I think that the California scene was aptly characterized by Matt Iglesias and Equip, which is California does 22 steps forward and 21 steps back, right? So that's really how it goes. If you talk to lawyers in the trenches, they'll say that the Housing Accountability Act and density bonus law reforms have been really impactful. The housing element law is finally generating some upzoning too. But other laws have actually made it harder to build on sites that have low value improvements and tolerant neighbors. In particular, the state has made it much harder to develop multifamily housing in existing neighborhoods with relatively low value existing housing. So there are now tenant relocation payments and tenant right of return requirements that make it very, very hard to redevelop any existing multifamily housing as a larger multifamily housing project. The California Voting Rights Act has resulted in the wholesale replacement of at-large elections with single-member district elections with demonstrably adverse effects on multifamily housing production. There's also questions about how rent control and insurance policies are affecting investment decisions. And then the last thing I want to emphasize is that housing really splits the Democratic coalition in Sacramento. So many of the major laws have required Republican votes to pass. Within the Democratic coalition, construction labor unions and groups that call themselves equity organizations are often in opposition to housing bills. The other labor unions, like municipal employees unions or teachers unions or the SEIU and environmental groups are usually just checked out, or worse, sometimes they're actually intervening in ways that make it harder to get housing built. And finally, suburban representatives are pretty wary about extending the ADU model to more intrusive or denser forms of housing. There's a bill that would have taken the ADU model this year and applied it to duplexes and lot splits, and that bill died in its first committee. So that's my big picture on the California scene, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was fascinating, and I really appreciate the longer history of housing affordability debates in California, and the really nice introduction to some of the coalitional dynamics that I think are going to come out in our continuing conversation. I'd like to now turn to Libby Murphy, who's the Director of Policy at the Minnesota Housing Partnership, and Minnesota, and in particular Minneapolis, has been seen as a success story in a state that was, until very recently, a Democratic trifecta, and is now in a liminal divided state.
Yeah,
Libby.
so it's coming off of a presentation on California. It's interesting because Minnesota electeds like to say we don't want to be California, but in so many ways, what's happening in housing, we're very much there in terms of some of the same challenges and the same dynamics. And we're on a trajectory to have as large a housing shortage proportionate to our population as California, right? So stepping back, my name is Libby Murphy. I'm the Director of Policy at Minnesota Housing Partnership. Minnesota Housing Partnership provides technical assistance and capacity building services to rural communities and tribal nations throughout the United States. And then we focus our state and federal policy efforts on Minnesota. So yes, Minnesota had a trifecta in 2023 and 2024, and that got a lot of national attention because of the number of progressive pieces of legislation that moved forward during that trifecta. And Governor Walz, who was gaining national attention as the VP candidate, I think also brought attention to what is happening in Minnesota and all of the progressive policies that were moving forward. Minnesota is not a DFL trifecta state. The last trifecta had been in 2012. And so 2023, 2024 were huge for Democrats in enacting some of the most pro-worker packages of legislation amongst all the states, among other very progressive policies. And that those wins were made possible by the trifecta. And to be clear, it was a very slim majority. There was a 1-seat majority in the Minnesota Senate. There was a 70-64 split in the Minnesota House of Representatives. And this year, the Senate still holds that 1-seat majority because they weren't up for election in 2024. The House is tied. There's been a lot of drama in our House of Representative politics. So it's technically tied, and there's a unique power sharing agreement. So we're back to like partially divided politics. But one of the lessons learned from the 2012 trifecta was that Democrats needed to be prepared for the next trifecta. There was a sense that Democrats hadn't taken advantage of the moment. They hadn't met the moment. There were missed opportunities. At the time, Democrats thought that moderation would help them maintain their trifecta, and they could have longer term impact if they took more moderate, kind of a slower pace in terms of the things that they wanted to get accomplished. Well, that backfired, and they found themselves in divided government for another decade. So that was something that was not lost on the members who were part of this trifecta in the last biennium. And so with a very narrow victory, a huge surplus, and an awareness of this unique opportunity, Democrats made a lot happen in that, especially in that first year. It slowed down a little bit the pace of legislation that they were moving forward because 2024 was an election year for members of the House of Representatives. And I'll say, because this pertains to housing wasn't as prepared for the trifecta as some other issue areas, because labor in particular, along with House and Senate Democrats, had been doing a lot of groundwork for a decade since they lost their trifecta, the previous trifecta, and housing really wasn't brought into the fold. We weren't brought into those conversations and a part of developing this agenda in preparation for the last biennium. And so when it came to housing, there was this mentality, and there's this sort of mentality in Minnesota that Minnesota doesn't like to do things first. And so when it came to something like land use and zoning, we weren't prepared, even though advocates who are members of this coalition felt like now is the moment to tackle land use and zoning. Elected officials were, let's wait and see what happens in other states. Minnesota doesn't like to be out there first. And so that really hindered any ability to make progress while we had the opportunity with the trifecta. But we were able to do a number of other things because advocates in the housing space had really laid the groundwork for talking about investments for housing and the need for things like dedicated revenue and things for tenant protections. So we were able to make a number of successes happen in those spaces. And one of the things that did help, though, was that labor and other progressive organizations were beginning to talk about housing in other spaces. When I started work at state level politics, labor was interested in housing from a building perspective. Investments in housing meant that you were creating jobs, union jobs. I was told our members aren't benefiting from that housing, though, so not all labor was at the table, or all union members were interested in advancing housing. That has significantly changed as other unions have identified. While we have good paying jobs, we can't afford housing anymore. For the first time in MHP's reporting, even a registered nurse can't afford the median priced home in the state of Minnesota. So that's a huge shift within the past decade that has really brought other folks to the table. So I just say that as, so in the background, there was a lot of work on this kind of run, govern, run coalition that was building and laying the groundwork to have an impact when, so we were able to get $2 billion in investments for housing during the trifecta. We had made the case we needed large investments. I think one of the things that we're going to be facing is that those investments aren't impacting people for a number of years out. Aside from things like emergency rental assistance, it takes a number of years to get buildings built. And so people aren't feeling that when people are up for election. And so it's not felt as this win that's impacting people. And so it's an opportunity for Republicans in particular to say investments aren't the solution and it's regulations that are the problem. They were able to pass a metro sales tax, which was huge because securing dedicated revenue on other issue areas had taken over a decade, but they were able to kind of ride this trifecta into enacting that. Again, landlord-tenant laws. And I think part of what happened, things that were able to succeed that were in the policy realm were things that aligned with a larger narrative around kind of anti-corporation rhetoric, anti-corporation narrative. So while corporate C-suite execs are profiting, while average Minnesotans are more and more of their wealth is being extracted because of high rents. And we saw this especially in the manufactured housing space, this conversation about how private equity is buying up single family homes, even though I think the data wasn't necessarily saying that is a huge issue in Minnesota, but it fed into that narrative. And so those were areas where you were able to see success. I will say that in Minnesota, other issue areas started looking at how do we advance our public policy goals through housing. When we subsidize housing, we can tackle things like climate and transit priorities. But at the same time, that is increasing the cost and making things significantly more difficult. And I know I've kind of gone over, I want to talk more about some of the land use and zoning work and the challenges that we've had because of the perception that some of this was coming from more conservative trade organizations prior to the trifecta. So it was really hard for us to overcome some of that perception. But I will talk more about that with questions that are coming forward.
Great. Thank you, Libby. Super interesting. And I'll try to bring us back to that. And finally, I'm very pleased to welcome David Schleicher, who is a professor here at New Haven at Yale Law School.
Yeah, so I was asked to provide more of a national perspective, kind of a step back on why blue states have failed so spectacularly at producing housing, and particularly why, despite both expert opinion among, blabbers like me, and also among like the last two Democratic presidents have said that zoning reform is such an important piece of this puzzle that blue states have still not done so. And so I want to start off by saying that there's no reason to expect that they would. There's two reasons why you might think a democracy would produce account results. That one would be responsiveness to preferences, that they're giving the people what they want. And the second would be retrospective evaluation of outcomes. Housing prices are bit bad in some way, and that people are angry about it. But one of the kind of key findings about state legislatures in recent years is that state legislative elections have nationalized. That is to say, when we vote for state legislature, we're really voting for president. If you like Donald Trump, you vote for Republicans. If you don't like Donald Trump, you vote for Democrats. And as a result, there's no particular reason to think state legislative results will produce accountable results because people are not voting based on the things that state legislators decide. And relatedly, you should only expect responsive results on issues where national politics most state politics track national politics. And so where it's like an issue like abortion, you should expect responsive results. But land use and housing more broadly isn't really an issue like that. To the extent it's a national issue, it's pretty bipartisan. And to the extent that it is about land use, there's not really any national analog. And so there's no particular reason to expect Democrats to have a coherent or effective response on housing growth. And there's no reason to expect them to be punished electorally for bad outcomes. And in fact, the fact that housing prices are extraordinarily high in California and Massachusetts has not produced any bad results for Democrats in those states. And Democrats do not agree on the importance of land use reform. So, for instance, people like Chris or Anne Marie and me think we should reform zoning, but there are lots of Democrats who live in rich towns, suburban towns, who don't think that. There are a lot of remaining degrowthers who think that we shouldn't be too focused on. There are people who are skeptical of deregulation kind of ideologically. There are a lot of those in law schools as well as in politics. And then, as Chris noted, there are a lot of groups that are part of the Democratic coalition that think that you should be able to extract benefits from new development, whether that's community groups looking for affordable housing, or whether it's labor groups looking for labor, whatever it is. And as a result, there's not a ton of not necessary agreement that, or at least that defines Democrats. And in fact, the changes in the Democratic coalition during the Trump era have made them more skeptical of housing growth, even as elite opinion and mass opinion have moved in the other direction. So Democrats have become more dependent on suburbanites over the Trump era as the coalitions have changed, particularly rich suburbanites, and they've lost Black and particularly Hispanic and Asian votes, the last of which who are traditionally pro-growth constituencies. Importantly, they have not lost the interest groups that are associated with them, maybe non-representative, who are still a part of that everything bagel coalition. Part of the politics. And so what we've seen across states is that places for places with blue trifectas that have passed substantial land use reforms, some effective, some less effective, have largely done so despite internal to Democrats' political conflict. That is to say, it has not been the Democrats united against the Republicans, and they've done or with substantial cross-party support. So California's bills, as Chris noted, had lots of internal Democratic opposition and had lots of Republican votes. Massachusetts MBTA communities thing was a bipartisan vote. And in contrast, places that have tried to go it alone with Democrats have largely, although not entirely, lost. So Anne-Marie brought up New York State. New York State was an effort to do so on a purely one-party basis, but it was a half a party basis or less than half a party basis in order to try it. It wasn't super effective. Connecticut is roughly the same story. There are some exceptions, like Colorado did so in a kind of a one-party basis, but there it's all conditional spending. It's kind of a less aggressive type of reform. Notably, by the way, the same thing is true in Republican states. So Texas has passed a lot, despite already being a relatively pro-housing growth state, has passed a lot of reforms, or is kind of in the effort and making efforts to do so. And they're doing so despite substantial losses among Republicans and with bipartisan support. The kind of darling of the pro-growth Montana did so on a bipartisan basis. One other thing to note, governors who stand a little bit outside of the nationalization of politics standard are in almost all states. Arizona might be a notable exception. The governors have been more pro-housing or pro-land use reform than the median legislator. So what do I take from this? So the first thing is that the fight isn't about how can Democrats do housing reform? It's how can we convince people broadly to support housing reform? And that includes thinking about things in a bipartisan basis, even in blue trifecta states. Now, the types of arguments you'll use will be somewhat different, but the basics are going to be the same, that the key to all of these successful reforms, where there have been successful reforms, have been pushing decision-making to the statewide level and away from the local level in order to encourage participation not only by people in all communities, but by big interests who include employers and big unions to get involved in ways that they don't get involved in neighborhood rezonings. That is to the citywide level and to the statewide level, and then coming up with mechanisms for enforcing decisions against recalcitrant localities. And there are different ways you can imagine doing that. In blue states, there's these added difficulties about how to avoid adding everything bagel coalition regulations to make that kind of add things on. But the basic story is the same, which is that the fight over housing policy, because it doesn't correlate to national politics, is not a specifically partisan issue. It's an issue about mass convincing. It's about whether it's about convincing voters broadly, both Democrats and Republicans, and convincing interest groups to get involved, who are often, sometimes they're one-party interest groups, and sometimes they are, interest groups who play ball with everyone. So I think that the question of how do blue trifectas improve themselves really should be asked, how do we improve this? How do we address this policy across all states?
David, that was great. I think it really puts a nice kind of package around what we've discussed to kind of think about the links across these states and some of the common challenges. And indeed, what I'd really like to do is have us talk before we go into Q&A. I would like to think more about the coalitional dynamics, and maybe we'll break it into three parts. And what I would like to do is ask a question and have people on the panel raise their hands, and we'll move across these questions without everyone responding to everyone. So preview, I'd like to think about, okay, so to come off of what David just said, I'd like to think a little bit about the internal coalitional dynamics in particular. You guys have talked about the everything bagel problem, talked about the need to get sort of the Democratic coalitions trying to extract concessions, the degree to which the environmental and labor groups are often, as Chris said, either not helpful or checked out or not helpful. So a little bit on just like, okay, so where have we seen some success in bridging these factions and getting core Democratic constituencies, elite constituencies engaged? The second question, which Paul shared with me in the chat, is he'd like to know more, and I think this is really interesting, about this sort of cross-party development. So like, what's driving those? And maybe that leads to the last question, which is on the voter side. So maybe that those two can be linked. With the voters, I'm just really interested in the question of it seems to me that the framing that we've seen discussed, a lot of it has been around private equity. It's about tenant protections, not about zoning changes. And so what are the framings that try to address that issue that actually work in terms of bringing voters, at least to bring some pressure on politicians to do something on this front? So let me start with the first question. So for those who would like to speak a little bit about the internal coalition dynamics, either within a state or more broadly, David got us started there, but if anybody else on the panel want to talk a little bit about how they see these challenges, and just raise your hand if you don't mind. Well, maybe I will put Chris on the spot, if that's okay. Yes. Well, look at that. Chris raised his hand as I was going to put him on the spot. Go for it, Chris. Thank you.
All right. So in California, there has been a effort to negotiate labor rules that might satisfy some unions, but maybe not all unions. And over a couple of the most salient bills, the carpenters, which do most of the home building, split with the building and construction trade unions, which mostly does public contracts for things like roads and bridges. But it's not clear that that split has generated bills that work. So I think the effort to generate a coalition that includes some labor groups and some pro-housing groups is a work in progress. And I can't say that there's a success story yet to point to. And with respect to other unions, I would expect municipal employee unions, I would expect teachers unions to be significant players on the pro-housing side, but they have not been engaged very much for reasons that I really don't have a good handle on. Martin Larson, who's a political scientist in Denmark, said, well, in Denmark, of course, like everybody knows that it's the municipal employee unions that advocate for housing. They're the only group that advocates for housing. But that just hasn't been a thing here. And my best guess is it's probably ideological, like that there's a kind of anti-market ideology among the elites within most of the unions, and that ideology is leading to a kind of failure to engage with economic research and understand how the interests of the members are implicated. But that's just a speculation.
No, thank you, Chris. And I'm really struck by the degree to which the unions, which we're going to talk about in the decarbonization context, and as pretty critical players, have not been as natural allies in this space. Olivia, you had your hand up earlier. Do you want to come in on this, sort of with the Minnesota experience in mind?
Sure. I was gonna just first speak to the internal coalition amongst lawmakers and to David's point about, Dems and Republicans needing to work together. So, I mean, one of the challenges that we've had in Minnesota is when we had the trifecta in place, and even though it was a relatively new issue, the coalition of partners included a number of progressive organizations who were allies with the Democrat leadership. But the problem that we encountered was that land use and zoning conversations first began to bubble up from conservative trade organizations, market rate developers, and they were often paired with proposals to deregulate the housing industry. And so it was seen as, I had a lawmaker say to us, I'm confused. My friends, my allies are working with my enemies. And because some of these trade organizations had also, invested a significant amount of money in getting Republicans elected, thinking that that was going to get them, these deregulation type of bills through. To get land use and zoning through Minnesota, whether or not there's a trifecta or not, is going to take bipartisan work. There is as many Democrats who are opposed to land use and zoning reform as there are who in favor, and as many Republicans. And so that's, one of the things that we're grappling with of how are we bringing a bipartisan bill forward in Minnesota? It's really challenging to do that right now because of how divided politics are in the moment. And so that was our challenge in 2024, and it's been our challenge in 2025. And we don't have a solution at the moment of how do we get over this. And part of the problem within the Democrats is there are NIMBYs who have been elected, and that's a challenge. And then there's deference that they're giving to their mayors and their local electeds who don't run on the same agenda. They don't use the same frame when they're talking to their constituents. And so they're not talking to their constituents about land use and zoning, but they're talking to their mayors and their city administrators, and there's a huge disconnect. And we haven't overcome that yet.
That's really interesting. Thanks for that perspective. I'm wondering, Alex, whether you might speak a little bit to why things have seemed to be a little bit more coalitionally promising, if that's the way to put it, in Washington State.
Yeah, it's always a little bit disorienting to me when I hear kind of the description of the national landscape. And because particularly what David was describing before doesn't really reflect what's happening in Washington State at all. And so I think that's figuring out how to unpack that is something that is important to do. I don't necessarily know why things are so different. But first off, Washington State has kind of prior to all of the policy changes that I mentioned, right, has already been a state that is growing a lot. Seattle is one of the fastest growing large cities in the country. And so I think that there are sort of some preconditions to the more recent conversations about housing. In terms of the coalition space, all of those interest groups that you guys mentioned or that some of the other state folks mentioned as not being interested in housing, right? Like housing is a top priority. More housing, making it easier to build housing, reducing the cost of building housing is a top priority. That's true for labor in Washington State. That's true for the environmental community in Washington State. That's true for equity-focused advocacy organizations in Washington State. Obviously there are specific aspects of the details of how to implement those policies where there is disagreement, and that's where a lot of the work to build those coalitions, build trust, identify what the right shared policy package is really important. I think there's a lot of work leading up to major legislative pushes. So both kind of in the year leading up to a particular legislative session. But I also think that this is something where you've seen kind of work on this type of coalition politics in Washington State going back a long time. Part of the Washington State as a sort of smaller neighbor to California, we have experienced people leaving California because of high housing prices and coming here for a long time. I think much longer maybe than this sort of more recent wave of people, doing that over the, since the pandemic. We also, I think, have a sort of a big part of the Washington State economic model is to be sort of like the Bay Area, but a lot cheaper. And as that has become less true, right, I think that has really scared a lot of folks and put a lot of pressure for action in response to that. And I also think, I think one of the things I'm hearing described in some of these other things, like with this sort of everything bagel description, is that there's a lot of kind of each constituency trying to get one little thing for themselves in a way that kind of diminishes the overall outcomes. And I think that we've been able to be much more focused on like, what are the big wins? What are the big top priorities for everybody in these coalitions? And then that means that you're not necessarily asking for your little piece on everything else, because you know that there is something that's really important to your constituency that is going to be part of kind of a overall bigger package. And I think one other thing that certainly for FutureWise as an organization, and I think for some of our other partners in this advocacy plays a big role, is that there was a very intentional kind of policy package process and coalition building effort in the city of Seattle about a decade ago. And I think that a lot of the work that was done there to kind of work through some of these policy tensions and coalition dynamics has kind of continued to build. We've been able to build off of that at the state level.
Great. Thanks, Alex. That city to state point, which seems to come out, that both the contrast and the potential spillovers there is very interesting to me. I do want us to get to the Q&A, but I wanted to sort of maybe step back just for a minute. I mentioned that I thought that we should talk a little bit about where bipartisan coalitions could be generated, or cross-interest coalitions, and what role voters might play. But maybe one thing that seems to me to be missing in the conversation, and maybe Chris or David, you could come in on this, is just like a very basic sense of where you think the blue trifecta states have been more successful in actually producing better housing outcomes. So Chris, I don't know, you had some of that really arresting data on California. What's your basic sense of where we might look for relative success?
I'd say accessory dwelling unit laws are the like one salient exception success in California. There's an interesting paper looking at transit-oriented development rezoning in Toronto, and suggesting, that's Canada, not the United States, but suggesting that Toronto actually did manage to create pretty elastic housing supply near transit stations. So it's possible to do zoning reform for multifamily housing in ways that work. Minneapolis has had some success as well with building apartments along corridors. The headline was Minneapolis ending single family zoning, but the form of construction that actually took off with these apartment buildings along commercial corridors. So there have been some successes, but figuring out how in a blue state you can create a political coalition that lets developers build housing at a low per unit cost has been tricky.
The one thing I'd add
David,
is
go
that
ahead.
Yeah, on the where legislative changes. Chris has been focusing on the legislation that worked, but where some of it is quite new, is that a lot of it is focused on either making decisions at the citywide level or the statewide level, but not on individual project rezonings, which is the traditional way we make zoning change in New York. So if you look at almost all the examples that we've talked about, all of the happy stories, at least on the land use reform side, have been at full jurisdiction wide. So City of Yes was a big success, while the city fought ably to get the NoHo zoning rezoning. That's an extremely small number of units of housing. It's great. I loved it. But it's the California stuff You see where the decision was made to do things at the statewide level, and to a lesser degree through the plans that happen at citywide level. You've seen a happier set of stories. In Minneapolis, the story of Minneapolis is a citywide deal, which is conditioned by a state law that requires citywide replannings. And you can see that a little more broadly, that one of the pathologies that was intentionally created, not randomly created, was that when people were skeptical of growth and were particularly worried about what they called growth machine coalitions of employers and unions and developers producing a lot of housing, one of the efforts they made was to localize decision making. And that, I don't mean just in local governments where zoning decisions are traditionally made, but in neighborhoods. And so one thing I've said about New York City is that because of the localization of decision, there's not a ton of difference between Greenwich Village and Greenwich, Connecticut. One is a town, an independent political jurisdiction, and one is a neighborhood that theoretically has no independence, but you can't get anything built without the say-so of the neighbors in either place. And so the effort to make that procedural change has been, I think, a necessary component, and it's been a necessary component for two reasons. One is that it allows for more mass public participation. That's to say that people vote for mayor or for governor. They have some idea what they're talking about when they have no idea who their city council people or state legislatures are. And so that can, but then importantly, it allows for a reconstitution of some elements of the growth machine coalition. So Chris wonders where the big municipal unions are. You could say the same thing about employers. Like JP Morgan is the biggest employer in New York City. JP Morgan would benefit from a huge amount from housing prices in New York City being lower. They could pay their bankers only a spectacularly large amount of money rather than a spectacularly large, enormous amount of money. But if housing prices were a little cheaper, but there's no real mechanism for them to influence region-wide housing prices, and only limited one to affect citywide prices. One last thing I'll say is that there's some things that can be done in this interest group management way, but a lot of the questions in the Q&A have been focused on like what's real genuine ideological disagreement. People say, why don't we decommodify housing, or why not rent control? And these are ideological conflicts that people disagree, and particularly Democrats disagree about. And so it's not, that's a question of why don't people agree, which is certainly why don't Democrats agree. And I have reasons why they should agree with me, but they have reasons they should,
Yeah. Well, this is the essence of politics. And of course, there is a huge cost to society and to these states of not having pressure to reach agreement, overcome some of these disagreements. As you said, part of this is an accountability issue at the state level, David. I want us to get to the Q&A, so I'm glad you mentioned it. One thing that I would love to, as I pull together some of these questions, to just sort of keep in mind is, to what extent are there any, so it's pretty clear, right, that moving up to higher levels of authority at the state level, and also it seems like moving from the legislative to the executive more broadly, has been helpful. But the other question is there anything that the national government, under very different circumstances, might be able to do to encourage the states that have the biggest challenges? We also haven't talked too much about what makes the red states different. I take your point, David, to be that they have to deal with coalitional challenges too, and so that could come up in our conversation. But I like the way that you framed that, David, because it is true that there are, as you can see in the really great questions here, that there are disagreements about priorities, and so I thought that Ben Gelman put it well and sort of captured this by saying, is this mainly about increasing supply, or is there a broader priority? He uses the term decommodifying housing, and Gus Christensen says he's not sure what decommodifying housing, but he's maybe decommodifying curious would mean. And Eli Moore brings this in too, and talking a little bit about like what about the focus on rent stabilization and eviction protections, which actually have come up a lot in our conversation. So one thing that I would love to, maybe we could take these three questions as a kind of group, and the way I'd like to do this, and inspired by how Paul handled things yesterday, is to have you feel as if I'm gonna give. We have about 10 minutes remaining. Let's try to keep two rounds. We have about 7 questions in the queue right now. And so I'd like to sort of put up these questions as a chance. Not everyone has to answer every question, but a chance for you guys to sort of choose among some of the questions. So here's a bundle of questions. Let's say 3 or 4 of them here are really about, okay, can't you, what is the core priority here? Is it just supply, build, baby, build? What are, a coalition often involves a kind of log rolling where you're getting people on board to do things that are linked but distinct. To what extent are there areas where you could see these differing emphases being achieved in similar, in larger legislative or policy pushes? And yeah, so maybe Anne Marie, you could kick us off on that because I think the New York example of how that fell apart at the state level is probably pretty instructive here.
Sure. There's a lot of questions packed into that, but I'll just
that's the idea.
Yeah.
So be very clear. Don't answer all the questions. Answer the questions you want to answer.
Cool. So I think a couple of things that come to mind. One, we actually, as really intentionally as an organization, it's like we actually got a lot of folks who were previously just mostly focused on tenant rights issues by coming out for good cause eviction and frankly figuring out how to talk about issues of supply in the context of scarcity and its impact on tenants. Like a line we use a lot that frankly I think has helped reframe something for things for people is like your landlord has like no competition. They can charge whatever they want. They can do whatever they want. It actually should be the opposite. And people are making money off of scarcity, right? Like, and constantly sort of thinking of how do you frame this as there is not one silver bullet solution. If it like, this is decades in the making, this is a whole lot of really messy policy issues layered on top of each other. But the fact that we are so fighting over scarcity makes everything, exacerbates every single problem you could tie to this. And I think something we've been engaged, again, sort of speaking to the lefty side of stuff, we've been engaged with the social housing, a lot of the social housing bills that have come up and actually talk to the drafters of the New York social housing bill that's like, if you don't build an estate level override, you're going to run into the exact same problems that a private developer has of NIMBYs wanting to block something in the suburbs. So like, I think a lot of this is trying to figure out both the way you talk about these issues, even if you're kind of talking about the same thing, but you need to think about framing it and what resonates with people, because so much of this is about politics, and also figure out where the overlaps are, and just like build the relationships to try to sort of just, we need a massive coalition. This is all going to be sort of messy is a lot of the take when we're sort of starting from scratch.
Does anybody else want to talk briefly about this set of questions about particularly, the tensions between the folks who are focused more on, equity, including private equity, and those who are really saying, look, it's really this fundamentally a problem. We just need to really increase supply and development is the core.
So I think this is a real disagreement, and I think it is a disagreement because, and like, there's the academic-y, researchy people are all very, very supply focused. And then there are a variety of arguments, and they range in quality from things that are kind of normally distributive to things that are, to my mind, a little quacky. And including popular things. And so, for instance, take one that's very popular. It's popular among both Democrats and Republicans, by the way, which is this idea of banning private equity from owning houses and renting them out. And there's a substantial amount of evidence that this reduces rents. It's basically mostly transfers houses from the owner-occupied space to the rental space, and that big companies are generally larger, are able to rent things out cheaper. And so there's some evidence of market power, but for the most part, the research shows that this reduces rent. But now, why are people, despite the fact that this is mostly about a transfer between renters and housing, and there's no real reason to, like, we might like renters, we might like housing, we subsidize home ownership a lot already. Why? It's because people have a lot of baseline discomfort with the housing market and are generally kind of market skeptical or alternately they use this as a way to avoid avoid the actual problem, which is that building a lot of supply is going to be uncomfortable in all sorts of normal ways, traffic, noise, whatever. And they want something to say when people say to them, we actually need to build a lot more housing. The last thing I'd say about this really quickly is that there's a lot of that. What that suggests is that there's disagreement, but that there's room for agreement, that people can sacrifice some of their own preferences for others for a deal. And that I suspect in many of these places that that's what has to happen. The cautionary tale, I'd say, is Chris's, which is that California has sacrificed a lot to make deals. And what they've sacrificed is having bills that result in housing being built. That is to say, they passed lots and lots and lots of laws, and they all have carve outs, and like this is a real problem. And if you take one example that's like very decommodifying which is the requirement that lot splits or ADUs, they've gotten kept out of the ADU bill, but they've kept it in the lot split, that in order to split a lot, that's to say to take a single lot and have it break it into two so you can build two separate units on it, you have to be, it only applies to owner occupied units. They say only owners of houses can do things that investors can't. Well, it turns out that the people who are interested in taking their own house, knocking it down, and building two houses on is an extremely limited population, unless they're like a company that does this for a living. The effort to accommodate all viewpoints has resulted in California's lot split law, I mean, among other reasons, doing, I think the technical term is absolutely effing nothing, right? So
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
So that definitely is a problem, and I appreciate you responding to Gus's follow-up question. And sorry, Gus, I didn't mean to accuse you of being falsely of being decommodifying curious. So we have just a couple minutes left, and I know Chris wants to jump in. Chris, if you can just hold for 1 second, I want to just sort of throw out a couple of the questions that I think would be useful for us to take up in the last couple of minutes. And I think there are two that really stand out to me. One is, these are kind of linked, I think. So Josh and Mackenzie are kind of asking a question about both implementation and kind of priority. And I do think that one of the challenges is that it takes a while to do this. And the old way of doing housing supply increases, right, was sprawl, right, and which is, and then I'd like sort of to think about Kevin and Rick both have questions that kind of relate to like, okay, well, how do you get into this like a virtuous cycle in which you're actually winning in terms of doing something on the policy, and then that is producing, positive electoral results. So keep those in mind as we go forward. These are a great set of questions. I wish we could engage with them more deeply, but hopefully they'll be informing your thinking as you go forward. And with that, Chris, jump on in.
I wasn't going to respond to those questions, so I'll let someone else lead. Okay,
great. Does anybody want to pop in to respond to? I put those questions on the table, Josh's and Mackenzie's, Kevin's and Rick's. And there's Carmen is throwing in a question about the missing middle, which Libby talked about. Or we're going to take a 10-minute break and come back and talk about decarbonization. So we could go to our break. Does anybody want to jump in with the last comment based on these questions?
I mean, I was interested in speaking to the previous question.
Yeah, go for it, Libby.
Take time on that, and I think Chris was too. I mean, to the question about decommodifying or build, and how, they're in opposition to one another, but at the same time, you can do both. So there's a strong push in Minnesota to look at our existing tools. We're a state that's willing to invest resources in housing. So taking the resources that we're investing and thinking about deploying them differently, thinking about investing them in cooperative ownership, tenant ownership, social housing, instead of what we've traditionally done, which is pair state resources with the low-income housing tax credit program to leverage as much private money as possible through that program. And there's a pushback because people are rightfully frustrated with a number of issues related to that program, and so I think we can continue to do that. And those same organizations that are making that push also saw what happened in Minneapolis, which was when you increase supply, you mitigate rent growth. Did that solve all of the problems for those who are trying to navigate high housing costs and, crabby landlords? No. So I do think it's both, but when in Minnesota, where we had that experience in the city of Minneapolis, and we can point to building does help on the rent mitigation side of things. And we can look at, we are making investments. We can just repurpose those investments and we can do things differently to empower the residents, particularly those who are currently most vulnerable. And that's, I don't see them as in total opposition.
Great. Chris, do you want to have the last word? Yeah,
Yeah,
go for
just
it.
one last remark. I don't think red states and blue states, I don't think red states have all the answers either. And each kind of state has its characteristic problems. So if you look at the data on supply elasticities, they are declining in red states as well as blue states. Red states have the advantage of a tolerance for sprawl and a relative lack of anti-market ideology, but they have the disadvantage of social intolerance. And social intolerance makes it hard to change zoning in existing neighborhoods. Blue states have the advantage of social tolerance, which sometimes, as Anne-Marie pointed out, can be leveraged into narratives about equity and opening up existing neighborhoods to new types of people. And blue states have the disadvantage of intolerance of sprawl and anti-market ideology. And so maybe there's some way we can learn a little bit from one another. But I don't think any state is like really beautifully positioned right now for the future.
Well, that's a great note to end on. It. I don't know if it's hopeful, but I want to just note that but I think one of the things that we've really seen is that that this is changing, that the politics are changing really quickly on this issue, and the coalitional politics are shifting before us, especially in the states that have the most acute challenges. And it's nice to have hopeful stories. There's a really nice piece that David Brockman is a co-author on about how at the one issue that sort of complements what David was saying about the lack of state and local issues in a lot in people's electoral decisions in this sort of nationalized era, is that also housing is a really symbolic issue for a lot of people. And so this is what Chris, I think, was alluding to when he was saying, like, not just at the elite level, but also at the mass, public level, there's going to be a lot of complex assumptions and orientations that people have. And so part of it is trying to figure out how to get people to see the underlying issues in a way that's somewhat similar, right? So that, that development isn't necessarily evil. It could be the root of a way to address these supply issues, and vice versa, that people are concerned about the effect on say renters are not diluted, but there's actually real equity issues there. So this was a really fascinating discussion. Thank you all, and thanks for the great questions. We're going to clear the question queue, and I'm going to invite everyone to take, now it's going to be about a 5-minute break, and rejoin us for the next session on decarbonization at 1:30 Eastern time, 10:30 Pacific time. Thanks again to this wonderful set of panelists for a great conversation.